I've been working there since 2003, coming down from Berkeley, where I worked at Canyon Cinema, and for this job at the Academy. And they hired me partly because they wanted to expand at the Academy the work they were doing on experimental filmmakers. It's not just for Hollywood filmmakers only. But one of the very, very first people I contacted about bringing his collection into the archive to take care of was Pat O'Neill, because I'd gotten to know Pat working at Canyon Cinema, and not only was he just an absolutely singular, kind of fascinating artist that made work I felt like was not like anything else I'd ever seen. But just getting to know him a little bit, just talking on the phone or whatever it might be, in daily business at Canyon, I found him just to be such a wonderful, delightful, generous, kind person. As I know many of you here know Pat, and I think you would probably all agree with me, he's just a really special guy. I'm so sad he's not here with us tonight. Speaking of which, he and Martha Colburn are buddies, so he might be at Martha's show if you want to see Pat. So come to Martha Colburn's show, not just for that reason, but that'll be a great show. But so when I got Pat's films at the Academy in 2000, I think it was late 2003, I just started looking at them to see what could be done to restore them. And unfortunately, it turned out that a lot of his classic films of the 1970s were finished on a film stock called Ektachrome Commercial, which the 70s and early 80s iteration of that stock is very, very unstable. It turns out the color fades really quickly, unfortunately. So all of Pat's films from the 1970s, until he switched to working in 35 millimeter, the colors faded. So I knew I couldn't really work on them in a conventional photochemical analog way. And so I just sort of was working on his earliest films and his most recent films, which could be done photochemically, restoration-wise. And the idea was eventually I'd be able to get a grant, hopefully, or the technology would arrive that we could do digital restorations of those 70s films. So they would really come out beautifully. And finally, thanks to the Film Foundation and the George Lucas Family Foundation, we got a fair amount of money to restore a number of Pat's. We were able to get some funding to restore a number of Pat's films from the 70s. And so the process has been, so far, Saga series is the very first one that's been completed. We've scanned the original for the film. Not only was the color faded, but the original is damaged in the case of Saga series, thankfully not with any of the others from the 70s. And then at a really wonderful digital restoration house called Roundabout, we were able to correct the color, correct the damage. And Pat, and then where's George, actually? George, where are you? And George, yeah, Pat and George came by, and we all looked at it together, and kind of, I think we were all pretty happy with it. It looked pretty amazing, I thought. And ultimately, it will actually go back to film, too, because I think it's important we have it available digitally and on film. But since this really just got finished, and Adam worked with Pat to put this show together, it seemed like a fun opportunity to just premiere the restoration of Saga series. And so I actually haven't seen this particular DCP yet, so I'm very excited about it. But for those of you that are analog aficionados, don't fret. There will be film version as well from the restoration. It's just not ready yet. So, and this is just the first of several that we'll be working on. So, yeah, thank you very much for coming. Also, I think Where the Chocolate Mountains is a really major work of Pat's. I think it's his first of hopefully many really major digital works, because I know digital was quite a transition for him as well, as it's been for me as an archivist. And he, I think with this film, has made a really major statement very much in a digital domain that's quite exciting and powerful. So I hope you like it, and I hope you like Saga series. And turn it over. George, are you going to come say something?
No, George is going to hold off
George
to the
will do
Q&A.
after. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And here, do you want to grab your seat? Trouble. Should we talk about the premiere briefly first? We could also just see as any questions before you come up. But well, in general, when working with Pat, like, how does your work start on a film? What does he hand you? At what point do you start figuring out what the sound side of things will be?
It completely varies, because Pat's an artist, and he's not working in a context like a normal production company might work, where you come up with something, you plan it all out, then you shoot it, and then you send it to post, and then it's done. He'll shoot something, and then it'll sit on a shelf or on a hard drive or something for years. There is stuff in Chocolate Mountain that was shot in, I think, 1971. So the process really can vary very widely in that whole thing. I mean, and sometimes I'm not just involved in the sound. I tend to be involved in things from before they're shot, really, because a lot of things I can tell you when Pat goes off to do shows in Europe or in Mexico or something, places like are in Chocolate Mountain, he'll take a camera with him, and so I'll tend to go through the camera and make sure that it's set up in certain ways that I know it should be, so that we can kind of meet certain specs that we're going to want to meet to work within the workflow that we have and all. And then he goes off and does stuff. I can tell you a lot about like where things are shot, how they're manipulated, because I'm involved in much of that. Where the ideas come from about what you're going to put with what comes right out of Pat's head, and I can't get in there. So you're going to have to ask him about that.
So let's talk first about the world premiere piece, the piece for Jack.
An Extra Wander. That is kind of, it comes out of elements from a piece called Squirt Gun Step Print, which Pat, what he did was he had some 35 millimeter film, and I believe he squirted a developer or a fixer with a squirt gun onto the film as it's laid out in the dark, and then developed it so that it got these streaky patterns on it and all that are really kind of interesting and beautiful to look at. And then they went into an optical printer, and Pat's a big fan of something called progressive loops. Loops are essentially taking the same, in this case, short piece of film, like maybe 10 frames or something, and running it, and then running it again and again and again and again. That's a loop. A progressive loop would be if you take 10 frames and then you run it, and then you back up, instead of backing up 10 frames and running it again, you back up 8 frames, say, and you run 10 frames forward. And then, so that the film keeps progressing forward and the image continues to have an ebb and flow and evolution to it. It's not the same thing that's repeating with a rhythm. It's got that same rhythm, but the image keeps changing. And that's Squirt Gun Step Prints. This piece took the elements from Squirt Gun Step Print and combined them, layering them and kind of flipping them so that they're sort of butterfly images, and then using digital composite layering modes to sort of create colors and pull colors out where things might not have originally been and all. And then at some point, Pat decided that it needed something else, so that's when all of those thin images at the left side of the screen came into the process. Those got added in. It was a silent piece originally, and then just a couple of weeks ago, he said, do you want to do a soundtrack? So I said, okay. And so now we have this.
All right, so how'd you do the soundtrack in 2 weeks? What did you decide to include, and how did you all decide what sounds to bring in? And
Well, Pat actually, because he was away in New York doing a show, and then came back, and there's always a certain recovery time. So I just went off and did this. I took some sounds. There was something I wanted to play with called a low frequency oscillator, which is basically a way of animating, in this case, the mute button on some sounds. And so you can change the frequency of how often the sound is muted. And I used that on a couple of sounds. I had a sound I recorded outside of my dentist's office. It was a dental autoclave, and this high-pitched, whiny kind of sound. And then I also had a sound that I recorded when we were in Norway of this giant dump truck. We were up at the end of a fjord, and it was very quiet, and there was a giant dump truck up there with a load of gravel, and it poured the gravel, so I slowed that down like 16 times or something. So I had those two sounds, and I ran this oscillator on it that gives it this beating sound, and I played with the frequency on that until it seemed to have some kind of empathy for the rhythm of the step printing. And I know Pat likes the noir stuff quite a bit. And so I did a couple of tests. I showed him the stuff with the oscillator and the beating sounds and everything. And then I threw in some music, and kind of went, what do you think? Should we have music in this? And he was kind of Pat, and he was like, oh, I don't know, it could be okay. And so I went off and put the music to it at that point and tried to get a sense of progression to it and everything. And it's really different than seeing it silent. It gives, I think, a whole different feel that, to me, was pretty unexpected to the paint. And we can talk about the paint a little bit, because that's kind of a recurring thing. Mm-hmm. That hadn't been done for a long time, but in this, it gave it a different quality, a more surreal, ominous kind of quality that the silent piece didn't have at all. So then he was pretty okay with that until day before yesterday, when he said, "Hey, do you have any screams?" And I kind of went, well, I'm sure I can get one, but I knew what I wanted to do, because I have a whole library of the stuff you see listed from the public domain sources, from Prelinger and places like that. So I kind of went, well, if I'm going to do this, I should really do it right, and I should just go through all these films, these public domain films, like horror films and noir films, because they're got to be loaded with screams. So I should just go through and log them all and separate them all out and then pick the best ones. And so I did that, and then yesterday we got this mix that has the scream in it.
Yeah, so this is mix. So come back and see it next week, and there will be a new mix.
Yeah, it's like you can't let them alone with stuff,
So whenever he brought in the representational imagery for that, like, left fifth of the frame, mm-hmm. the sound that you chose to mix, to have the sound come in that would always correspond to that, or like you'd cut away from the main sound or lower the main sound and have a prominent sound to correspond to that in a one-to-one relationship. I'm curious about that choice.
To some extent, it's just for variety. It's just, if you heard that constant beating for 7.5 minutes, you'd pull your hair out and run screaming from the theater, So you need to break it up a little bit. And there's some other things that break it up a little bit also. but it's just you need to give people, who are stuck in their seats, some kind of breather sometimes, and so that was kind of what that was about. I thought about that a little bit in terms of the first couple of things are fairly representational in the sound, and then it's a little different. It's kind of like crunchy, screechy sort of groaning kind of sounds with kind of body imagery and stuff that don't necessarily go together. But then there are things like the leaves and the wind and that kind of stuff. I mean, those were not. I mean, those are added sounds and mixed, but they are pretty representational. But they're not the sound that came from the camera. So.
And can you speak about the title?
I don't know where An Extra Wander comes from. For Chickie is for Chick Strand, who was a close friend. She and her husband, Marty, were close friends of Pat and Beverly for a long time, forever. And so he wanted to do something, I think, in her honor, kind of. She's, Chickie's an important filmmaker and probably needs to be a little more recognized. I think a lot of people don't know her work, and it hasn't been shown maybe as much as it could be. So
we had shows with her, but yeah, it's certainly an ongoing effort that's needed.
Yeah.
Any questions so far from any of you about either film? Going to the nitty-gritty, please.
Well, I can't even imagine the number of sound elements that were in Chocolate Mountain. It's really, really vast array of sounds there. And does Pat describe to you that this section should have this kind of ambience, or does he guide you, in making selections, or does he have selections? I mean, going back to Saga series, I remember he actually loaned me an album for the Chinese orchestral thing, the Chinese themes with Western orchestration. It perplexed me so much. I asked him, what was that? Hong Kong Art Tune Company is what it was. Yeah. But I think it was something he had.
Yeah, well.
So some of this comes from him.
Yeah, again, it's kind of a mix. What we do is there are sounds that just come out of the camera, sometimes, and then I have sound effects that I've recorded, and so I keep a copy of all the stuff that I have up in the computer at his place, so that he has that there to go through and see what he wants. One of the big characteristics in Chocolate Mountain is something that he's been doing a lot the last few years, which is to slow things down, and really slow them down to like 3-5%, speed, so that they get very low and rumbly and everything. And so sometimes they're actually pretty representational sorts of sounds, but they're just distorted by being slowed down so much. So that's kind of, and then he'll go and assemble things, and then I'll look at what he has and I'll bring it down to my studio and kind of clean things up, because a lot of times when he makes loops out of things, he's a little off on like the rhythm of things, and things will paste over, so they won't quite keep a consistent rhythm, and I'll fix that kind of stuff, and that's fairly mechanical kinds of things. And then once I see what he has in things, I'll just sort of see what seems like it might go with it, how it might mix. The one of the big aspects of that has to do with things like sound placement. There's a lot of voices and things in this that kind of move around the space a little bit. When it's being assembled, if those voices are there at all, which most of the time when it comes to voices from films and things like that, that's stuff that Pat has found. But I'll work on placement and getting the sound field to sort of fill evenly or unevenly if that's what's necessary, and try and get it all to work together to fill out a big room like this, because when you're sitting in front of an editing machine, it's all kind of right in front of you in one sound space.
It really does sound great in the big room.
Yeah.
Amazing soundtrack, just amazing.
Thanks.
Can you talk about the musical interlude in Chocolate Mountain toward the end there, with the vocal? There's a lot of vocalization. It sounds like horns.
You mean at the really the last piece there with the trees and the
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
That was a piece. I at this point I don't recall what it is exactly, but I do remember the process, which was that Pat had that imagery that was some of which was shot by Joan Logue in New York in the park in the snow, and was combined with. And that's an interesting thing, actually. Some of his sculptures, his wood sculptures. He has a bunch of works that are cones, and he's layered them, cut flat planks, and layered them, and then shaped them into cones, so that each layer, kind of like plywood, is layered, so that each layer the grain goes in different directions. So when the cone turns, the grain seems to go in opposite directions. And then if you take that same image layered on top of itself, only flipped, so that it's kind of you get a butterfly image, but they're both moving. That's when you get that very liquid, watery kind of feel to it. And the tempo at which that was moving and all. He had a piece in there that was like a piece of contradance music or something, and I looked at it and it just wasn't quite sitting. The rhythm of it wasn't working with the image. It wasn't quite hanging together. So I just kind of turned that off and went looking for some other things through the sources that we'd been using. And found whatever that stuff is. And part of it, I do remember specifically looking for plectrum type stuff that, something that felt sparkly, like some of you get the fine detail in the trees that Joan shot, and the way that those move across the wood grain that has that liquid, watery kind of feel. It gives this very sparkly kind of feeling that just felt like some kind of plectrum instrument or something. And there's all this banjo stuff, so it worked out perfectly. So you wanted to layer those things, but partially to make them less recognizable, because you don't want to be tapping your foot and kind of going, let's all hum along to the thing. You want it to be part of the picture.
The layering worked out very mysteriously.
Yeah. Thanks.
Here, Chris.
Especially regarding the soundtrack, it sounds like the way you're describing it, it's a true collaboration with you two guys working together and two artists, which is kind of hard to work out. I get the feeling, I'm wondering how much of when I'm listening to the soundtrack, how much is George and how much is Pat, and could you speak to what percentage that is? 60-40 is he's kind of liking what you do?
It's more back and forth. It's really more like Like I turned him on to the Prelinger library, you know, because I was looking for stuff for some work that I was doing. And I found that and I just went, free found footage, you know, this
And
is
that's
great.
Visual and sound.
Yeah, and so, you know, a lot of
Things.
things, a lot of the music and things, and as a part of the Internet Archive, there's also the cylinder recordings section, and Pat really liked that because
Was that old wax cylinders? And
yeah,
audio, radio stuff?
he really liked that stuff because it's all so old that there's no rights issue.
Right.
So nobody can come knocking on your door and say anything because it's all too old. So he liked that stuff. So, you know, it's like I'll turn him on to those things. Then all of a sudden he's got a whole bunch of stuff.
You
And
feed him material to listen to, right?
yeah, and he'll be cutting things and looking for like rhythms and sounds and stuff. And he'll just kind of find things because when he's putting together picture, if there's sound with the picture, sometimes the sound then also gets slowed down if he slows something down, and sometimes that stuff sounds great. So, you know, that will become part of what he puts into there. And then I'll work with it in other ways, you know, add reverb, sound placement, maybe replace that sound with a different one that does the same thing. And kind of build up a bunch of things, and then closer to the end, we'll get together in my place and sit there and go through it, and he'll sit there and look bored, like, are we done yet? Can I go? And then we'll hit a place where it's like, no, we need to get to here, and it's like, okay, now what do you think of this? And then he'll have to, you know, he'll come up with ideas and things and see and give me some guidance on what he's interested in those places. But it's a lot of back and forth up front. You know, it's like I'll supply some things, he'll use them, I'll refine them or change them. Then, you know, he'll add more things because he's constantly, you know, you think you have, okay, here's a sequence that looks like it's kind of together, and then it'll move on to something else, and then that sequence will come back and get changed again because all of a sudden he'll discover that this sequence down here that he was working on works really great if you put it on top of this sequence, and now instead of having 12 tracks layered on top of each other, you got 20. And things evolve that way. You
That
know?
was something I was curious about, because you started out making that comparison to commercial work and how this isn't made anywhere near the way that a commercial job might be made. And that made me wonder how much Pat changes his mind, like a difficult director might be. Does a lot of stuff get redone, or is he, does he change his mind a lot? I mean, I realize as things evolve, they need to be changed.
It's more a question of he has difficulty with the software, you know, and I mean software is really confusing if you're not a software head, you know, and so he'll, not to get too far off in the weeds, but he doesn't understand what a nested sequence is. And so he'll take some images, combine them together into a single image, put it somewhere, and the next thing you know, he's accidentally gone into that image, used it somewhere else, added a whole bunch of stuff to it, and now it's like in that other place where it originally was is completely different. And so he has those kind of issues with understanding how the software works. And sometimes that works out really great, you know, because
You about nested compositions and
yeah, and sometimes things develop a complexity that they wouldn't otherwise. So
Maybe one more question. Well, let's do the question right behind you,
What is
Chris.
the software, the imaging software for layering, and
what's that?
what is that software?
I'd say 95 to 99% of the stuff in here is done in Final Cut, a very old version of Final Cut. There's a little bit of stuff. There's some things some of the things that get slowed down, and particularly there's some stuff where there's like little lines, like line drawings look very kind of deco sort of styles of animated line drawings. Those are actually LED lights. I built them a set of LED lights, basically, that we could do different things with. At one point, I put one on the end of a finger of a glove and put a button in the palm of the glove so that he could like push the button and wave his finger around and turn the light on and off. And then at other points, we had a stick that I put half a dozen LED lights on that he could wave around like that. And if you slowed down the camera, there's a sweet spot with the camera that we were using where if you slowed down the shutter speed just to the right place, if you went too far, it would start repeating frames. But if you didn't quite go that far, it would streak. And it would streak just a little bit, and then you could take that image and put it into the Final Cut Suite has a program called Motion. And there was a thing in there called Trails, which if the streak was just long enough, you could set the trails so that it would pick up the trail right at the end of where the streak was, and it would make it look like a line. And that's how all those lines were done, was basically LED lights with a slight streak on them put into a trails thing that turned them into lines. So, so there's no drawn animation.
And the flaming rope.
That's a flaming rope. That was a very dangerous flaming rope in the backyard.
I want to know about the barking dog. Where did the barking dog footage come?
That was in Ireland. That was a trip we took to Ireland. That was in a place called Carrigaholt. And we pulled up there. Pat and Bev and Ellen and I were there. And there were these crazy kids over on one side of this little canal who were just doing their best to destroy somebody's sailboat. It was moored over there, and they were like jumping up and down and trying to rock it and do this stuff, and you know, everybody's kind of looking at that. And I was looking over here, and there's this dog, some kind of spaniel, and he just kept barking at me. And it was like, should I be scared? He's wagging his tail an awful lot. I'm not sure. And after a few minutes of that, I finally figured out that he really wanted to play. And there was a stick, so I started throwing the stick and as that was going on, Pat realized what was happening, and he came over and started filming that stuff. And somehow the dog is in the movie.
More questions about anything in particular? Or in general?
One thing I'll say, well,
Go ahead.
David first.
I was just going to ask what's going on at the studio now.
Well, yesterday I finished mixing this other thing.
No, I mean, since then. Are there other projects?
Yeah, there's always something
Yeah.
going on.
Any more optical printing projects?
Specifically optical printing? Not really. Actually, David helped us out with what we've been using that for recently. It was because he loaned us a red camera that we used to capture a lot of 35 millimeter footage that was shot for Decay of Fiction, which is another Pat's film.
Okay.
And so we captured all that, digitized it, and then have had that to work with. So that was the last time the actual optical printer was used, was for that. One thing I did want to say was that some of what the imagery I find interesting in Chocolate Mountain, and you see it also You see it in An Extra Wander, but you also see it in Saga series. Pat, there are two things that hadn't been done for a while that kind of came back, which is the paint stuff. You see that in Saga series, which is early 70s, where he's using solvents. He makes a painting that's layered with different paintings and different colors underneath, and then he hits it with solvents, which are not particularly visible. So as you film it, the painting just seems to sort of melt away and reveal other colors. But because it's melting, it takes on another kind of shape and composition to itself. That was something he was doing in the 60s and 70s, and has kind of come back and is pretty prominent in Chocolate Mountain. The other thing is the bilateral symmetry. You know, images that are flopped on each other so they form a butterfly kind of image is something that he kind of took it about as far as you can go with a film called 7362, but has gotten interested in that again because it's pretty easy to do and interesting to experiment with. So he has a lot of fun kind of playing with different images and layering them in that way. So some of this stuff, techniques that haven't really been, or he hasn't been using for many years, have come back in a big way, I think, in a very interesting way. So, any questions? Any answers?
Any additional insights? Well, actually, no, it's a good time to wrap up as well. I wanted to thank you very much for joining us, giving us a lot of insight.